Welcome to our next section, Securing the Kernel and Services. In this section, we're going to take a look at how to configure the kernel against remote attacks, disabling unnecessary services, and how to harden necessary network services. We start with configuring the kernel against remote attacks. The Linux kernel is a very powerful tool. It has lots of features. Some of them are good for security and some of them are very bad for security. If you don't configure your own kernel, you will receive the kernel that was given to you by your Linux distribution. So, by configuring your own kernel, you can get full control of how the kernel should be. Compiling your own kernel is, however, not easy. And you have to repeat it every time a new kernel version or a kernel patch is being released. So, the following slides, you should be very wary to adapt them. So this is only for people who really want to have the full control and also want to spend the time on maintaining and compiling the kernel. In this slide, I'm showing you my recommendation for a strong, hardened Linux kernel. Here you have protection against stack-based buffer overflows, enhancement against exploitation of kernel stacks, kernel dynamic allocated memory, and also local security things. You see, there's lots of things you have to do here. If you use the stock Linux distribution kernel, lots of these have already been configured. Editor, I'll restart by showing a prompt and some commands, and then I'll continue with this slide. In the previous slide, I showed you lots of configuration options for the kernel. How would they be applied? I can't show you the complete steps of how to compile a kernel because that would be not part of this training, but you can find lots of information on that on the internet. And just give you a quick look. First, of course, you have to install the package for the Linux kernel source. I did that here with this command on a Red Hat, CentOS, etc. This would be yum install Linux source. Depending on your Linux distribution, either the source is already including with patches or you have to apply the patches yourself. In most cases, you have to apply the patch yourself. I'll not show you this because it would just complicate this example. In the Linux source subdirectory, there should be a file called .config. If it doesn't exist yet, you can just create it. In this file, you see all the config options available for the kernel. And these matches with the one you saw on the previous slide. So you just look for the option and ensure that it's set to yes or no, depending on my recommendation. After that, you just configure the rest of the kernel and compile and install it as normally. If you have compiled your own kernel or not, there are still things you have to configure on the operating system side. So you can dynamically configure the kernel, and this should be done during the boot up. Thankfully, all Linux distributions already have a configuration file for this. This is called the sysctl, and the file for this is in the ECC directory, the sysctl.conf file. Here you can configure various things like kernel pointer restriction, randomizing address spaces, and network anti-denial of service stuff. In this and the next slide, I will show you recommendations what could be configured to protect your system against remote attacks. As there are quite some options, if you're curious what they actually do, you can find all the information on the Linux kernel homepage, where there's a description for all these values. Most times on the internet, we still use IPv4, the Internet Protocol version 4. However, the protocol version 6, IPv6, will become more common in the future. And you might already be using it, even if you don't know that. As IPv6 is a very complex protocol, it also carries risks. So if you're not using IPv6 and you're sure you're not using IPv6, you should disable it. And these are the two commands you should put in the sysctl.conf file on disabling it. Only do that if you really know what you're doing and that if you're really not using IPv6.